I think the strangest thing about Richard Feynman is that he spent a huge part of his life trying to escape the exact thing people remember him for, the genius label. Which sounds ridiculous because if you've ever fallen into a Feynman rabbit hole, he almost feels designed in a laboratory to become a legendary genius. The stories are absurd. He cracks safes at Los Alamos, he plays banjos, he solves impossible physics problems, he embarrasses experts, he explains things so clearly that people still quote him decades later. It's almost too perfect. And that's exactly why I got suspicious. Because whenever someone becomes this mythological, I start wondering where the actual person went. Where does Richard Feynman end and the character begin? Because the more I read about him, the less he felt like a genius superhero and more like he felt like someone desperately trying to stay human inside a world that kept turning him into a symbol. And honestly, that version of the story is way more interesting. When I first started reading about Feynman, I expected equations, physics, Nobel Prizes, the usual genius biography checklist. Instead, I kept running into stories about curiosity, not intelligence. Curiosity. There's a difference. A lot of brilliant people want answers. Feynman seemed obsessed with questions. He took radios apart as a kid just to see what would happen. He challenged teachers. He annoyed authority figures. He had this almost childlike refusal to accept things just because someone important said them. And I think that's what grabbed me, because most people eventually learn how to stop asking questions. He never did. The weird thing is that this made him look fearless, but I'm not sure he was fearless. I think he was just more interested in finding out than protecting his image, and those are very different things. Richard Feynman grew up in New York during the Great Depression. His father encouraged a specific habit: never memorize something you don't understand. Names weren't important, understanding was. That mindset followed him everywhere. Even as a young student, he stood slightly outside the systems around him, not because he rejected learning, but because he rejected authority without evidence. Long before he became famous, he was already building an identity around independent thinking. And eventually, that identity carried him into the highest levels of science. At some point, the story stopped feeling inspirational to me. Not in a bad way, just stranger. Because then you get to Los Alamos, the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. And suddenly, this playful, curious person is helping create one of the most destructive technologies in human history. That's a difficult thing to sit with, even now. I found myself constantly bouncing between admiration and discomfort. Because Feynman wasn't some distant villain. He was funny, charming, brilliant, human, which somehow makes the moral complexity harder. The people who change history are rarely simple. And I think that's what unsettled me. We want neat categories: hero, villain, genius, fool. But real people keep refusing to stay inside them. The scientific world Feynman entered was changing rapidly. Physics had become one of the most powerful intellectual forces on Earth. Governments suddenly cared deeply about scientists. Funding, prestige, and political influence expanded dramatically. The Manhattan Project placed extraordinary minds inside extraordinary circumstances. Many believed they were racing against catastrophe. Others simply focused on solving technical problems. In that environment, curiosity and consequence became deeply entangled, and Feynman was right in the middle of it. I don't actually think Feynman was chasing fame. That's the part people often get wrong. Fame kept finding him. What he seemed to chase was understanding and maybe freedom. freedom from rules, freedom from expectations, freedom from becoming trapped inside someone else's version of who he was supposed to be. You see it everywhere, in the way he taught, in the way he talked, even in the stories people tell about him. There was always this resistance to performance, which is ironic because he eventually became one of the most recognizable scientists on Earth. And I honestly wonder how much that bothered him. Because once people decide you're a genius, they stop seeing your mistakes. They stop seeing your confusion. They stop seeing your humanity. And that's a lonely thing. Feynman's obsession wasn't fame or status. It was understanding reality as clearly as possible. That pursuit led to breakthroughs in quantum electrodynamics and eventually a Nobel Prize. But it also became a philosophy. Question assumptions, test everything, distrust easy certainty. The challenge is that this mindset doesn't stop at science. Once you start questioning everything, it becomes difficult to accept comforting illusions everywhere. The gift and burden are the same. You see more, but you lose simplicity. The more I thought about Feynman, the less I cared about the Nobel Prize. Honestly, lots of people have won Nobel Prizes. Very few continue feeling alive decades later. And I think that's because people recognize something familiar in him. Not the genius, the curiosity. That restless feeling that maybe nobody actually knows what's going on. That maybe certainty is overrated. That maybe the most honest response to the universe is fascination, not confidence. There's something surprisingly vulnerable about admitting that, especially in a culture that rewards certainty all the time. Feynman's story lingers because it isn't really about intelligence. It's about our relationship with knowledge itself. He represents a version of expertise that remains curious rather than arrogant. A version of intelligence that stays playful. People revisit his story because it feels increasingly rare. Not because he had all the answers, but because he seemed genuinely comfortable living with questions. And that feels strangely modern, maybe even necessary.